So today on the Coachcast podcast, myself and Ash are joined by Matt McInnes Watson. Hopefully I pronounced that right. So thanks for joining us, Matt. Really appreciate it, buddy.
Thank you very much for having me on, guys. Appreciate you guys getting me on.
No, it's great. So we've been kind of firing a few messages back and forward. We've had a few chats over Zoom during lockdown and stuff like that. So, and I like the way kind of your mind thinks around plyos. It's a little bit different to an extent to kind of what's already out there. And I know we've talked kind of off air saying that, my favorite quote, I'm just going to put it out there from the start, is you can't always just quote Verkhoshansky when it comes to plyos. Okay. So with that, I know that's, and it's like there's not much out there necessarily in plyos. Like we were saying, how much kind of you get asked about plyos, where to go. There's not loads out there. So I think you obviously doing your PhD in plyos is awesome. So I actually want to get into some of the nitty gritty today with that, but I'm going to start off pretty plain and simple for maybe some people that aren't well versed in plyos and things like that, and just start out really basic and go, why are plyometrics important for athletes, and what physical qualities like do they develop?
Yeah, so I think that actually it's not a simple question, in that I think that a lot of people kind of need to constantly reiterate this sort of question in their own mind. I like to kind of do that with the simplest, like, why are we using strength training, or why are we using speed training? Like what are we hoping to get out of this as a training method? And plyometrics for me is becoming more and more about just general locomotion and being able to move, whether that's at very high velocities, whether it's change of direction, whether it's being able to turn on a dime, whether it's being able to lunge and get out of that position. And plyometrics themselves, I think, provide an athlete the capacity to move very well in a locomotive sense. And what I mean by locomotive is pretty plain and simple, in that we are putting our foot in the ground and applying force in a certain direction to send our body that way. And I think plyometrics is a really useful way of teaching you how to utilize kinetic energy. So if we are moving at speed and we decide to kind of change direction, or we, as I said before, we lunge to avoid an opponent, then there is a landing strategy there that then needs to be assorted in a way that is either going to beat the opponent or is going to get you to that outcome goal that you are hoping. So yeah, plyometrics is primarily about landings and takeoffs. And if you can sit there and list down how many movements within sport have a landing and a takeoff, I think you're going to be there for a while. And I would almost say that most movements with a landing and a takeoff can be plyometric in some format. Now, there obviously is a lot of discussion around the time frames in which you need to be on the ground for. There is also a lot of discussion around high forces with plyometrics, and I think plyometric spectrum, it is growing, and we're looking at a lot more lighter versions. We have the older stuff where there's very, very high loads, and the old stuff of looking at, high acceptance of eccentric forces, and that stuff does come from Dr. Yuri Verkhoshansky and the old Russian methods. But we're kind of now creating a spectrum, I think, and those hundreds of thousands of movements within sport that have a landing and a takeoff, I think, fit nicely along that spectrum. And we kind of look at the gold standard being under, Schmidt Bleacher is the only man ever to have said that it should be under 0.25 of a second within research, and now everyone is like, well, it has to be. I don't know why, but we just have to categorize everything that's under that as plyometric. I've struggled personally to find other good resources that have said that, and I think he does have a good chain of thought as to why he's put that as the time frame for a plyometric landing and takeoff, because a lot of very high speed movements are done within that time frame. And I think quality landings and takeoffs are within that time frame as well. I think as soon as you start to push past that, someone that's poor at, let's say, long jump or high jump, whatever it might be, if they are over that time frame, the likelihood is that they're not going to be that successful at it in terms of outcome goal that they want from the takeoff. It's a very large answer to your question, but hopefully you can kind of understand that there's a lot to plyometrics now, and I think that we need to we as a profession need to go down that rabbit hole a little bit and really look into movement itself, because I don't think anyone has a clue how to organize movement. I think it's a very big task to go with, to say like, what can we categorize all of these movements. So I kind of like to do a little bit of pigeonholing of a lot of movement into plyometrics.
Yeah, and I think that's just really interesting. Just trying to have, you think, more of like a principled kind of approach to kind of what you're doing, so we can actually systematize it. Is there anything kind of in particular? I know you kind of looked at kind of ground contact times and things like that a little bit there. Are you finding anything maybe within your research? I know if you said you go above that 0.25 kind of threshold, I'm not going to say it's not plyometric in nature, because you still got kind of that coupling action, but is there anything that kind of you're seeing?
Although we, as I've said about the kind of time frame, although we're scared to go over that time frame, I think that if you were to look at, let's say for instance, a 2-foot bilateral jump in basketball for, let's say, a world-class dunker, these guys are in time frames of between probably 0.3-ish to kind of 0.4. And are we to stand back and say that's not very plyometric? I don't know. It's that intrigues me a lot, and I think that the dunks world is a slightly untapped kind of place at the moment, and it definitely is growing. By all means, it's becoming almost a profession, and they're trying to look to go into the Olympics, etc. But that really intrigues me. Do we class that not as a plyometric? Maybe we do, maybe we don't. Maybe it's just within jumps and takeoffs as a kind of different remit. So that in itself really intrigues me, and I think that there are a lot of slightly longer takeoffs that, much like you could say the high level depth jumps that Verkhoshansky might have put in there, that are probably going to be over that threshold too. I also like to use movements that are a little bit deeper. So I have a tiered system, and in one of my tiers I have a support tier that looks at slightly deeper movements. So let's say that you're in a split position. These movements tend to go through kind of a natural stretch shortening cycle. There is a landing and there is a takeoff sequence to it, but you're going to be on the ground for around, more likely towards 0.4, 0.5 of a second. Now it's not slow, but it's not fast in comparison to, let's say, a sprint stride that's a fifth of that time. And I think those sort of movements also build a lot of capacities that support plyometric movements as well, which is really important. It's not very well researched, and it's kind of heavily towards what I do anecdotally within my programming and how I coach. That is always part of my coaching for plyometrics, and I'm kind of hoping to go down that avenue a little bit, maybe after my PhD, looking into kind of further research after I've got my doctorate.
Yeah, so I think that we've covered a lot of your philosophies on plyometrics there a little bit in detail. There's a lot that we can dive into. I think whatever order might be best to go and find out this, it's up to you, I think. But I think if we can almost have a look at how you classify your different tiers, and then potentially how you might use those tiers to, especially from my perspective, it's quite good to know how you might introduce like a novice from those tiers and almost take them to a more elite level. Sure.
So I kind of have we'll just put it down as 4 tiers. If I go into super specifics, then it does potentially become more, but I like to kind of generalize it into 4 structured tiers, and you'll be able to take from this whether they fit within the typical ideas of having intensive or extensive capacities to them. So we have a light tier, we have a medium tier, what I will call the ping tier, just because I took the phrase from my coach, and we've always done ping movements, and it just sounds great, and it does exactly what it says on the tin. And then we have the deep tier that I mentioned previously. The light tier is, as it says, is much more lighter, very kind of, I would say, not necessarily the fastest ground contact, but they are pretty fast because the ground reaction forces tend to be quite low. So you're talking about very kind of resilient movements where you're bouncing on the spot. People will call them
pogos and things.
Yeah, there you go. Exactly. Those sorts of movements. And this sort of tier I think is great because it's your way into plyometrics as a novice. It's your way into plyometrics in a training session. If you're about to start a training session, I will always start with light tier plyometrics. Let's just get the body moving. Let's get blood flowing. Let's get the brain firing. Let's get everything kind of mapped in the right direction for you to start dynamic movement. And I think it drives really good tendencies with things like posture. You're able to challenge the body a little bit more with the directions in which you can go because the ground reaction forces aren't particularly high. And again, you can challenge the ground contact times. You can play around with these sort of movements. So instead of doing a pogo for height, can I do a pogo where I'm as fast as on the ground as possible? I'm not going to necessarily get the height that I might get in a pogo, but these are the sort of variables that you're able to play with when you have a light tier. And I think that people they tend to see past it a little bit, and they're like, oh, this is a good way to use movements for, let's say, a warm-up or activation, when actually I've used a lot of athletes. I've had a lot of athletes that have used just light tier plyos for long periods of time. And these athletes they're not necessarily novice athletes. These are pretty well-developed athletes. And it was fantastic for improving things like ground contact time. So yeah, we've got your light tier. Sorry, go ahead.
Just before you move on to that next tier, just while you're kind of on that point, because I think that's actually a really important point, that if we stick with that example of pogos, for example, when you're saying you could have like a really elite athlete potentially staying with what would be classed as a basic exercise as a pogo for such a long period of time, and I'd completely agree. I think we try and completely overcomplicate like plyometrics and just building on a really good foundation. But do you mind for maybe some people, some of the listeners that maybe not necessarily don't understand, but maybe don't understand the full benefits of just varying the type of a pogo? Because I know that's something that we do with our training. Because you talked about there the height versus the contact time difference. Do you mind saying, kind of going into a little bit of detail there with maybe the different physiological adaptations we're looking at in those two variables?
Sure. So, and to kind of start off with one of the fundamental principles for the plyometrics that I coach are different variations of basic kind of movements. And I think they are fundamental in building a program around an athlete that, especially when you're looking at sports that are not so linear in motion. I think that these sorts of different variations of light tier especially are kind of fundamental in tissue building. So you're looking at tendon and ligament development, where you're playing with variability of being able to increase the amount of volume that you may use for this sort of movement. So that you are going to get, you're probably talking around maybe 2, 3, 4 times body mass upon landing, but you're able to do this. You'll be surprised most athletes will be able to have a pretty good capacity of being able to do quite high volumes of these sort of movements. And over a period of 3 or 4 months, that volume will be able to go through the roof. You'll be really surprised in how capable athletes become with higher volumes of light tier stuff. So I like to not just use bilateral movements. I think the light tier are fantastic for teaching unilateral movements. And I think a lot of people do get a little bit scared we are very much stuck with the pogo show at the moment. Everybody loves the pogo. And I question a lot. I kind of ask a lot more people to try out unilateral movements, especially within the light tier, because of the other neuromuscular and motor patterning skills that you get from unilateral movements. So for example, so what I will term a hop is a left foot landing on the same leg, or a right foot landing on the same leg continuously. Now the value of a hop is a kind of, it's special to me in that because the limb has to move at twice the speed as it would in a bound, you're starting to create habits within the body that improve your ability to pre-activate the muscle and the tissue around these joints that are about to receive force, which is a very, very big correlation towards more elite athletes. So if you are seeing an athlete that is particularly, you could say, I've got an athlete that's an elite guy, but they don't look particularly great when they hit the ground in a certain movement, and that might in sense be the way that they pre-activate and anticipate the ground. The highest of the highest elite triple jumpers are able to pre-activate the musculature around, let's say, the ankle or the knee at around 80% of their maximal output is what they would get when they hit the ground. So they're able to really fire up muscles before they've even hit the ground. Like you've got to think how much more that does for you in terms of improving your ground contact time and shortening that to a more of an optimal length, and how that also supports stiffening effect when you're hitting the ground. So your ability to stiffen on the ground at the joint and not crumble through that joint when you're receiving all of these super high forces. So your ability to kind of couple that and use that energy from the, let's say, the previous motion, and then use it in the movement after the takeoff. So in your concentric phase is much greater when you're able to pre-activate at a higher rate. And this is, I would say, should be I think it was looked at maybe 10 years ago, but we've kind of forgotten about it. I put that on Twitter the other day to someone. I'm like, have we forgotten about pre-activation and how valuable that is and what you get from hopping when you do that? Hopping teaches you to do that because you have to do that. Your body has to get ready for the ground because of the rate in which you're having to cycle that limb through. So you'll notice straight away that someone that can't hop is someone that's tentative, that doesn't want to land. And then you watch an elite guy and they hit the ground. You watch an elite triple jumper, and these guys are really attacking the ground. And that's because they have the ability to pre-activate and anticipate. So the light tier, I think, is a great foundational level of building in pre-activation methods, as well as building in neural patterns of being able to turn muscles on and on at a better rate. I think you'll also see this is also a great way to spot a novice mover or someone that's maybe a little bit more of a concentrically based athlete, and you'll see that like all I ever see is this constant thud when my athlete hits the ground. There's nothing that comes from it, and the likelihood is that they're probably co-contracting around the core at just a too high a rate. You know, when you've got a world-class sprinter, they're relaxed. When they hit the ground, they're obviously ready to go. But when they get off the ground, they're able to load, unload, load, unload. And light tier plyos gives you that capacity too. I think it teaches you those patterns about landings, and then you're air-based. You don't want to be stiff in the air. That's what you'll see in beginners. They're like, oh damn, the ground is about to come again and I'm not ready for this. Whereas a natural kind of plyometric beast will hit the ground, relax, hit the ground, relax, and they turn on and off at very fast rates. And that's another benefit to light tier plyos.
I think you can learn a lot quicker from that as well. If you're going, like you said, right to right hops, if you don't get that leg back down, your face is going to hit the ground. So it's exactly. it's very much kind of do it right, or if you do it wrong, you're gonna find out about it. And if coming back to that kind of stiffness, relaxation, that comes back to what the Russians, again, like talked about and researched. Was it Vyacheslav? I think it was, potentially. I probably maybe got that one wrong, but the kind of Russians and how they structured their 5 levels of athlete. and they found that their elite athletes could relax and then contract a lot quicker than kind of their even elite athletes. So it was like their elite of elite, and then what they call level 5, and there's level 4 athletes. There was like a 50% difference between those kind of elite of elite, level 5, and then the elite athletes, which is pretty amazing when you think of it, kind of coming back to what you're talking about there. Just on that kind of hopping again, are you looking at, especially early on with athletes, because some people might be thinking now, but do you not think like right to right, that hopping style might be quite intensive? Now, would you start athletes off, especially youth athletes? I mean, my opinion is they're hopping quite a lot in the playground anyway. They don't care about like knee valgus and stuff like that. So would you think would you start them off potentially, just because we like to have a system as strength and conditioning coaches, that we maybe start with like shorter right to right hops and then progress length and height and intensity and kind of do it that way? Or would you just be tempted kind of like they are in the playground and just be like, let rip, let's see what happens?
I think it's always nice to have a slight assessment of things before you get started. And I think I've kind of started to build a set of eyes now that I could see someone walk into an area or a gym or a facility, and I'm like, yeah, you can't hop, you can't, and that's just having a very large background of watching how people move and stuff like that. But I think that if you're going to use something like a unilateral hop, and do remember that a hop, so movement on the same leg, is very different to a bound. Please do not get it twisted with thinking that, okay, I'm going to progress my athlete now to unilateral movements. They can bound great, and then I put them in this hole of a hop, and what's going on? Why isn't my athlete able to move? They're so different in what they are as movements, and I term them as, you have your unilateral bipedal movement, which is bounding. You have 2 legs at that point, and your unilateral unipedal movement, which is you only have 1 limb. So you have got to work that limb at a much higher rate. So going back to kind of assessing and how to start things off, my mentor and coach, Eric Little, always used to, I would go with him to squad days in track and field, and he would get me to do examples and show things and stuff like this. It was about maybe 10, 11 years ago. And he would just line people up and just say, right, just start to hop on the spot. Just pick your foot up, okay? Pick it up over the ankle, and you'd be like, keep hopping. Okay, now try and pick it up over the calf. Let's see what happens. And then you just see people fall apart. There's certain people that are still moving really well, and then 1 or 2, you're like, okay, yeah, you can relax. Maybe switch to your other leg. Let's see how that changes left to right. That's also a big thing. Is 90% of your athletes probably can hop, but they probably can't hop on the other leg. So you've got 90% that probably can hop, and then another 90% on top of that can definitely not hop on their other leg. So you have to look at it both sides, because like I said, you can have a fantastic mover on their left leg, but oh damn, they've never used their right leg before. So you have to look at both sides. But yeah, just play with these things. Just start on a smaller amplitude. As you mentioned, kind of what's the best method to go with it. Start small, build big. You could also do, I like to set up games for young kids, and you can do things like tag, but you can only hop. You know, pick up your right leg behind you with your hands, and you have to hop and tag each other. What methods are the kids using to hop? If they do not pick their leg up over the knee, that probably means that they are not that capable of hopping very well. So they'll use a much easier method for them, where their leg doesn't come and climb over so much and then receive such a higher ground reaction force. The more you pick it up, the more load you're going to get on the next takeoff, is the way to look at it. So you'll see someone move around where they don't pick up their foot as much, which is a great method to test things out, I think. And people, you know, if a kid can't do it, then they'll probably just drop their other leg. Kids are pretty, you know, humans are pretty good with that sort of stuff. We'll be like, no, I can't do that, so I'm gonna give up pretty quickly. There will be some kids that are fantastic and they move well, but you can assess it really quickly with how well they pick that leg that's striking the ground up.
Nice. Yeah, I like that a lot. So then, just if we kind of slide down that continuum a little bit, we're getting towards kind of that, I think you classed it the medium intensity. how does kind of that look as we continue getting further and further kind of towards those? I think you termed the final tier like was it deep plyos?
Yeah, the deep stuff.
Yeah. How does the rest of that continuum look out?
So your medium tier is what I will class your bread and butter. So like your light tier is, I like to think as the light tier and the deep tier as my supportive tiers. They are the base of my pyramid, and they're going to support a lot in terms of keeping me healthy, building all these patterns in. Now I have my medium and ping tier that aren't very far away from each other, but my medium tier seems to be being categorized as extensive at the moment by everyone on social media, and my ping tier becomes it doesn't actually become my intensive tier. It still sits within the extensive tier because no one seems to think that anything other than a depth jump is intensive. So my medium tier is my bread and butter stuff. It is a lot of hopping, bounding, leaping, jumping, and you are using sub-maximal capacities to do it. It's pretty intense, don't get me wrong. You're still going to get high ground reaction forces. And if you're using a novice athlete, they're probably going to find it the most intense thing they've ever done. So yeah, your medium tier is probably the main bulk of what you're going to be using day to day throughout the whole of your athletic calendar when it comes to plyometric movements. And that is the basis of building, you could say, a plyometric capacity. It is preparing you for the most intense movements that you're probably only going to do a few of those within a week. And yeah, as it says, the continuum kind of goes up to the ping tier, which is doing things for maximal intent. It is leaps for height. So you could say maximal pogos for height could be a ping tier movement. And people will say, well, they're not as intensive as a depth jump. Well, if I've got an athlete that's jumping 60 centimeters into the air and coming down from that height, hitting the ground and jumping another 60 centimeters into the air, that's pretty damn similar to a depth jump. So that's how I categorize my ping tier movements. It's about being as dynamic, as fast, and as powerful on the ground as possible. So yeah, any questions around that? And then I can kind of move on to the deep tier stuff if you want.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask about how in practice you can see athletes kind of land differently sometimes. Some, a bit like you talked about, they'll be really loud on the ground and look quite rigid. Some will be quite light and quite absorbent. Like, is there something to be said about cueing for a certain type of landing? So, can you try and land soft or land hard? It almost sounds like you're saying if they're too noisy, it sounds like there's a bit of like wasted energy there. I don't know if I'm on the right line. Is that sort of right, or?
Yeah, to a certain extent. I think it's very much to do with the actual type of sound. Like we can all recognize like a thud, right? We can all recognize that kind of splat on the ground that doesn't, it's not kind of aesthetically pleasing to your ears. If you were to see world-class triple jumping, this is the best example of it. You can hear the crisp rip of the track when they hit the ground. It's crisp. It's normally one kind of bang, one good sound. But plyometrics aren't quiet, and there's this we must land like cats kind of idea with plyometrics, which is I've never seen anyone land like a cat, because cats for a starter, they're not built as we are. They walk on their hind foot, on their back legs. They have 4 limbs. Their actual foot is probably 5 times the length of what a human. If our foot was proportioned to a cat's, we would have size 50 feet. It just doesn't go down like that. So the way that their back legs are built is for absorption. It's for propulsion from that static stance, and then for absorption as they land. And they land like a parkour runner. They want to soften everything. We don't want to do that. I want to hit the ground and keep moving. Pretty much all sports like that. There's not much in sport where you want to land on a dime and be quiet like a cat. So yeah, it's about learning as a coach what good sounding movement is. So yeah, it's part of your development as a coach. It's exactly the same as hearing a barbell ching, right? When you want someone to drive with intent, you hear that ching at the top of the movement. You're like, well, you're obviously hitting that well, and you can test it with a gym aware or whatever. But you start to understand that movement, and the better your athletes start to move, you'll start to go, actually, that is the right sound for you as an athlete. So yeah, hopefully that answers.
Yeah, so it's almost like it's not like you have to work out what the sound is you're looking for, but not necessarily cue people in or out of it. It almost sounds like it would be difficult to coach somebody to achieve the sound. Maybe it's something where you've just got to expose them to the right, level of extensive or the light tier plyos first. Let them build it up then, and then you might hear that sound during those exercises, and then you go, okay, well then when you do versus don't hear that sound, that's when you've kind of hit the nail on the head.
Yeah, exactly. So what you're like, going back to that kind of example, is that if you were, let's say that you're using bilateral leaps in light tier movements and you're getting a real crisp sound, well, as soon as you go to a ping tier of saying, I want it maximally, and the sound completely changes, what's happening? Is the ground contact time just far too long? Or is there too much absorption at the joint? Or are all these things that are not in the right places happening? Or so I think that's a good way to look at it. I think that's I would probably use that as an example in the future. Actually, I like that. I'll take that one. Thank you.
on that point as well, is it, like you said, if you're going from a light to maybe obviously you're doing some like ping activities, and we stay with kind of that sound, would you be tempted to be like, okay, because the sound is different, we don't quite have the same maybe like pop, so to speak, that we typically see in our like pogos, for example. All of a sudden we've got kind of that longer joint coupling action. Then is that maybe an indicator for you that, okay, well, maybe the volume, we just completely cut back on the volume, we just sprinkle a little bit of these kind of ping tier stuff in there, we take it away, and then we slowly dose little bits back in until we start seeing that same type of pop effect that we get in the light tier?
Yeah, I think so. Absolutely. Yeah, I think that's a really, really solid method to kind of go with. I think that, don't get me wrong, you're always going to have certain movements that are never going to sound as easy as other movements. There is also that issue with things when you start to do things for maximal intent, which actually aren't necessarily what will happen in sport. For someone like yourself, Kris, there probably aren't many maximal movements in tennis. Do you know what I mean? Like, there's not 100% efforts. It's a very precision-based sport as well, with skill. So the likelihood for your capacity to be 100% or within a very, very high bracket is probably for a very small period of time within the game. So actually being very good at sub-maximal capacities is also where we want to be. So the ping tier, or even the stuff of depth jump stuff, it doesn't necessarily have to be always perfect. So it might not necessarily sound, so our light tier and our medium tier stuff might sound very similar, but as soon as we go absolutely flat out, the ping tier stuff might not sound as good, or it might not look as perfect. But that is where we're applying force. Maybe that's more towards our force end of the spectrum. And we're able to get more out of medium tier stuff where we're working purely on shortening the ground contact time. So like I said, you're always working along that spectrum, and how relevant it is to the sport in particular is also important.
Yeah. And I think it comes back to that earlier point that you made, which I know we've actually talked about before on a previous call, that no one ever, and I've said this for quite a long time, but no one ever produces force quietly. And that's the thing, that coming back to that cat analogy, and that's the thing that it just kind of frustrates me. If you see a car kind of taking off like a drag race or anything, there's a lot of sound going on because they're trying to create a lot of horsepower and put that into the ground. They don't all of a sudden just set off in first gear and take their time, So that's kind of the analogy that I just think of there. But no, that's fantastic. And then just getting onto kind of that deep tier, like what that maybe looks like.
Yeah. So the deep tier is kind of, as I said, as it sounds, it is about absorbing more force around the joint. And people will say, oh, it's not very plyometric in nature, and it is more of a support tier. but it is part of my plyometric family because I think it brings a hell of a lot of qualities that are really important to being successful at very dynamic plyometric movements, and that's in improving things like dynamic posture, being able to deal with eccentric loads through longer positions as well, which I don't think you get. I think people use like overcoming eccentrics or things within the weight room, and you're like, you really don't understand what it's like to try and deal with eccentric force from a landing and then to get out of that at the same sort of rate. So that's always like using a split stance is the best example for that. Like we'll use like a bilateral split exchange leap. When you pop for height and you come back down and receive that load in a deep split and get back out of it, you start to understand how the body starts to couple that energy. So when you're receiving that energy upon hitting the ground, and then when you're trying to use it to get out of it, and again, it really does show maybe issues and deficiencies within the athlete as they move. It's a great way to assess it again. I think it's really, really valuable.
Mm-hmm. And then, so if we just kind of move on a little bit now, so we've talked a tiny little bit about maybe the different athletes and things like that. You mentioned tennis a bit, but how do you kind of take your approach with like a court sport athlete or a field sport athlete maybe to a track and field athlete? Because a lot of people try and take that track and field model and try and fit kind of square pegs in round holes, and it doesn't always work. So what's your kind of opinion on that, and how does that look?
Yeah, so I think you always have to look at I will always look at the positions of a sport, and how much time in tennis do you spend, or whatever court sport, how much time do you spend at like max velocity, or how much time do you spend producing the most force possible when you're stood up? You spend a lot of time in acceleration mechanics. You spend a lot of time in change of direction mechanics. So it's about building a program that will facilitate a couple of those points. So using large varieties of multi-plane, multi-directional based movements is very important. So that in itself drives a lot of sub-maximal plyometrics, because we are linear beasts. We are not, we can move very well kind of side to side, maybe in more of a diagonal motion as we move, but actually moving left to right and moving backwards is not in our forte as animals. So we can be very maximal in this direction, but we can't really be maximal in those directions, I don't think, personally. We can be up there, we can be at 90%, maybe a bit above that, but we cannot be, I don't like things like people using lateral depth jumps. I'm not sure on them. I prefer to use a lot more drills that are kind of organizing the body themselves. It's in ways in which you're figuring things out, rather than just chucking someone off a box and going, well, we hope that the body will understand what that feels like to fall from that height. So I use things like medium tier plyometrics to do either lateral leaps or moving back and forth based stuff, or unilateral movements. So like using things like skater bounds is fantastic if you've ever used them before there. And I use them in a very short, sharp, rigid variation, as well as a deep tier one where we're really absorbing load. We're genuinely becoming ice skaters at that point. So it's very much about using sub-maximal stuff in the different directions and planes, and more maximal stuff in more of our linear based or just up and down kind of base movements.
Mm-hmm. So try and use the body as it's built, raise the ceiling, and hopefully that'll kind of bring everything up and those other physical qualities up with it.
Absolutely, yeah.
So we talked about as well, I think maybe at the very start, maybe it was off camera, I can't remember now actually, but different types of plyos and using things like assisted plyos and stuff like that. What do you see as kind of the main benefits? Because there's obviously, with like triphasic training and things like that coming out from Cal Dietz, band assisted, like Overspeed has become like quite a big thing, becoming more and more popular as the kind of years and Instagram posts go by. So what kind of are the benefits that are really derived from band assisted training and jumps?
I don't know if this is just bias of me. I don't know if it's me being lazy to try this form of training. I have not done much in terms of, the typical band assisted where you hook it around a chin up bar and you're using it in your hands here and driving the body up in a bilateral way. I like it to an extent, but I think it's very one-dimensional in the capacity that it drives, because I've used it on the track where we pull people and we use band assisted pulls, which I find when you're working the horizontal side of things, I think it brings a hell of a lot more in. So you want to try band assisted pulls for a hop, and it's accelerating that leg into the ground even faster rate. Yeah, it becomes at the opposite end of the spectrum, because obviously the band assisted stuff is to take the load off, and you're working the faster ground contact time. So I understand that you're trying to play with the different ends of the spectrum with the force velocity curve, if you would say that plyometrics even fits on the force velocity curve, which I think is also a too simple a way to place it as well. I think that when you're playing around with landings, I think that it changes it slightly differently, because realistically I'm trying to be as fast and as powerful as possible when it comes to plyometric movement. So when you play with the spectrum of the force velocity curve, it doesn't really fit within that, because actually there's no way that you'd be able to put my hopping capacity on your back and lift it, and it's going to be way quicker than it is for you to be able to squat it. So yeah, I'm sorry to say it, but I don't have that much of an opinion on the assisted stuff, and that's because I always think that there's a lot more to be gained from doing lighter tier based stuff. We've played around with the partnered stuff where you're using each other's shoulders. That's quite good, but you are bringing in the side of a higher ground reaction force, because you are giving yourself more height. So what are your thoughts, Kris, on it? I'm intrigued to hear what
Flipping the action here. Wow. Okay. I think similar to yourself, actually, to a degree. Like, I've used it a little bit. I've used it in my training. I don't think I'm the type of athlete that really benefits from it that much. But I think if you've potentially, now I don't necessarily think you need to be a super elite athlete to be able to use it, which is interesting, because I've used it with some tennis players, for example, who really struggled to produce force quickly. Not necessarily because they're weak and things like that. It's maybe just because they've never actually experienced what that feels like. So for me, like, just being able to take maybe an extra 30% of their body weight off of them, and then maybe go into some band assisted jumps so they can feel what that actually feels like. Now, this is another thing. I haven't actually tested my theory in terms of, let's do some band assisted jumps. So like pre-test, jump test, band assisted jumps, post-test. Do you get like a pop effect or anything kind of going on there? But I definitely think there's that kind of overspeed training effect. And it really is athlete dependent, because personally, I don't think it works that well for like me. But I've had other athletes that quite like it. Now, whether that's a novelty effect as well, I don't know. It looks cool, and we want
sure. Who doesn't want to jump a meter in the air? Yeah, I think
exactly,
what always conflicts in my mind is that it tries to be very much like overspeed work with a 1080, which is actually the opposite of what you were getting, because you are not eccentrically loading the body as you do in overspeed. In overspeed stuff and downhill running, you are getting a higher eccentric loading. In banded assisted jumps, you are reducing the eccentric load. So although it's resisting you as it pulls you, your leg is hitting the ground faster, which is in turn giving you a higher eccentric spike. So what you get in terms of adaptational side of things is quite different. I couldn't give you the physiological processes of what's happening, because I don't think I'm qualified to try and even get into it. But I don't think that you are building the capacity that you want in an overspeed drill. So if I run at 10 meters per second and I want to run 10.5, well, if I pull myself at 10.5, I'm training the eccentric loading to a certain extent of what I would experience at 10.5. I'm not doing that if I want to jump 1 meter in the air and I have to use a band to do that. I'm not getting the eccentric loading that I would normally get falling from a meter to try and then equal it. And that's some of my issue that comes with it.
Yeah, no, and I think that's a fantastic point. That's where, like, I've used if we call it hands assisted variation, which I think you touched on before, where we can jump and we can use our hands to give us more height, which is fantastic because we get a little bit of an overspeed, but then equally we get that overspeed eccentric as well, which is where I think more of the adaptation's coming from. And I think potentially that's why I don't find it very useful when I do it personally. And I think that's quite a highly potent stimulus as well. If we're going hands assisted jumps, because when we get, like I said, we're getting the overspeed jump, but then we're getting the overspeed and overloaded stretch on that Achilles tendon, and then we can really slingshot ourselves back up. That's where I think it can be used really well. And I think that is quite a potent stimulus. And I think and this could be something else. I mean, how often would you think using that? Because I think it is quite potent, and I wouldn't want to use it too often because, again, your body just gets adapted to it and just bluntens its response.
Yeah, I would probably agree. I actually think as well that you would get a really nice response from a split version. I haven't actually tried it, but I'd be intrigued to see if people play with that. It's probably the certain thing that you might put in like a 4-week block as you're coming into like a hypercompensation period where you're gonna chuck them in a bit of a hole for 4 weeks and then see what comes out of it. But then you probably won't touch it for another 4 months. Do you know what I mean? Like it's one of those. And I think you'd have to do a lot to get to that place as well. Like I would like to see a lot of other movement for you to get the real adaptation out of it. Because I think that a lot of people will play with it and they'll be like, oh yeah, I feel great from doing it. But you're like, well, adaptational side of it, you might feel good doing it. I don't mean it's actually giving you what you hope for it to give you in your performance and outcome of the performance. So yeah, that side of it is, it's a bit hearsay and people anecdotally say this and this. So yeah, hopefully that's kind of giving you a little bit of an insight to what I think.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think that's definitely gives a lot of people an insight into kind of maybe the reasons why they should or should not do it, depending on the situation. I think this is the important thing to put into context: the situation of that individual athlete. Because that's not something, like I said earlier, that's not something I would give to all my athletes. Maybe some of them that struggle with certain aspects or need a certain stimuli or stimulus. I just want to I know we're getting on a little bit on the time here, so I want to be wary of that. I have got 2 questions left that I've kind of just made a page of notes here, but I want to touch on the female athlete because I know we have talked about that before, and I think it's important to understand. So when it comes to the female athlete in plyometrics, are there any differences between kind of the male counterpart or like what are you? I know I think from what we were talking about earlier, that maybe the research is a little bit kind of up and down, but what do you think about that?
Yeah, I think the research touched upon similar stuff to how you would see tendon adaptation. That's a big part of it. There are obviously differences with hormonal responses with how tendons and soft tissue are adapting when you compare a male and a female athlete. So that tendons are your friend in plyometrics. If we didn't have tendons, we wouldn't be doing plyometrics. We would just be lifting weights. So on the female side of things, I will always use just a slightly tweaked version of how I would look at a male's program, and that's purely based on tensile strength and the capacity for a male to be able to impart more force at a higher rate. So it tends to be that the guys like to have a lot more hard-hitting stuff. Maybe not so much. It doesn't have to be a massive stimulus, but if you were to look at 10, if you're going to do 10 movements in a program per se, well, let's say that 6 of them are real ping-based movements. They're really intensive stuff. Well, the females might have the flip of that, and they might be using 7 sub-maximal movements and 3 maximal movements. And I think that's purely to do with how we are adapting the tendon tissue. And I think that the females tend to do better with higher volumes of submaximal work. It doesn't seem to be in the research quite yet. I haven't personally seen it, so please do let us know if you've seen some research on females and using extensive in comparison to intensive versions of plyos. But that's something that I'd love to touch upon later on in my academic career, is to look at these sort of variabilities when it comes to female and male. There's so much to do with it in strength training, but we haven't really touched upon it in the speed world or the plyometric world. But there may be stuff in the speed world. I'm not hugely well versed in the speed world of research, I don't think, in comparison to plyos. But
well, I think that's interesting actually as well, because that's something that I have noticed, that the females typically do deal with a higher volume of, if we use your terminology there, those kind of light plyos, just really building up a good base of robustness essentially. And they don't seem to really get bored of it either. Whereas the guys, that they want that kind of novel stimulus all the time. You've got to think, even if it's like you want to stick with your pogos, for example, you've got to think of different ways to make like a pogo interesting at times, which is like, there's only so many ways you can pogo, but I mean, you can definitely stretch a pogo a good degree. But I've definitely found that with the females versus males in that kind of stuff.
Yeah, and there's a lot to go into when you're looking at the different types of plyometrics that you're using when it comes to submaximal versus maximal stuff, and it does tend to be that the females prefer more bilateral and bounding based movements, where I found that the boys potentially like more hopping based stimulus, and that's probably because of the intensity of the stimulus. Apart from one female triple jumper that I had that would hop for the whole training session if I made her. She's just, unbelievable.
I kind of just want to jump in on that one quickly, because just in relation to like my environment, I've kind of noticed the same in the females preferring the submaximal thing in the weight room, just because it takes a lot of psychological, I guess, engagement and readiness to commit that hard to something that intense. So maybe it's transferring across to the plyo world as well, where it's kind of rare to find the female individuals that really want to push max strength, whereas they're way more just, I guess their engagement is they just would prefer to do more submaximal, higher volume. It's just, maybe there's not anything specific behind it, but it is like a general bias, I think, to just preferring that anyway, and not being psychologically ready to fully commit 100% to those things, because it takes a lot of things to line up, I think, maybe, and just mood and how you feel.
I think it's probably quite primal, in that we as the men would have been the fast kind of hunters, and they would have been the endurance animals that would have been looking after the herd of our family all day long, sort of thing. So there's different tendencies to how we are, I think, as humans, and that might fit primarily back to the weight room and doing plyometrics and speed work or whatever it might be. So yeah, I can relate so much to it when it comes to the submaximal versus maximal in females and males. So I think it's a really interesting topic as well.
Perfect. No, I think that's a good point to finish on. I know we're just over the hour mark here, so I don't want to keep you too much longer. I know it's getting a little bit late, kind of where you are. But thank you very much for coming on. Just before we go, do you mind telling kind of people, I know you've got a few little projects going on now, kind of maybe tell people where they can find you, where they can find out more about those projects and things?
Yeah, so I'm very active on Instagram, so you can find me at McInnes Watson, McInnes Watson. That's on Instagram and Twitter, but I'm mostly vocal on Instagram. And I also have a plyometric training program, online business, where you can pick up and grab plyometric workouts for a whole range of sports. We've got volleyball players to track and field athletes, to dunkers, to basketball players, tennis players. And you can subscribe. It's at plusplyos.com, or you can go to plusplyos, which you'll find on Instagram as well. So yeah, that's kind of the main things that I'm getting into at the moment, but there will be developments on those bits within the next few months, especially. So yeah, keep your eyes peeled for it. And if you love plyometric content, come to my Instagram page.
There you go. No, absolutely. I would advise anyone to head over there and have a look at various programs and the high quality information that you definitely put out on Instagram. So, but here we are. We'll close it out now. So thank you very much for coming on. I really appreciate it, and I know Ash does as well. And I've got pages worth of notes here, so thank you.
Thank you very much, guys.
Cheers, Matt. Thanks.